Your lecturer is Amanda H. Padani. Dr. Padani is a professor of history at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. She received her PhD in ancient Near Eastern history from the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Padani is the author of The Ancient Near East, a very short introduction, The Land of Hana, Kings, Chronology, and Scribal Tradition, and the award-winning Brotherhood of Kings, How International Relations Shaped the Ancient Near East. She has published on the Hana Kingdom, Scribal Traditions, and ancient legal practices.
Hello. When I'm introduced to people at social situations like dinner parties, there's always that question we all get asked. So, what do you do? I'm a historian. Oh, do you teach? Yes, I'm a professor of ancient history. Ancient history, like the Greeks and Romans? No, earlier than that. I study the ancient Near East, Mesopotamia. At this point, I usually get one of two looks. One is the glazed expression of someone trying to remember anything about Mesopotamia. The other is the quizzical expression of someone wondering why in the world I chose this particular area of study. How did you get interested in that, they ask, as though I'd expressed a passion for the study of something ridiculously esoteric, like the anatomy of olive pits. The reaction would be different if I were to say that ancient Egypt was my field of history. Everyone is fascinated by Egypt. It has a really good PR team. So many specials and documentaries on TV, entire sections of museum bookstores, kits to teach yourself hieroglyphs, all those mummies and pyramids and obelisks. And if I were to say that I'm an archaeologist, again, the reaction would be different. Archaeology has a swashbuckling aura. Archaeologists are fearless people who go to distant places and find mysterious buried remains from long-forgotten times. Unfortunately, Mesopotamia has no Indiana Jones. So my passion for this subject needs explanation, which underscores the need for this course. But I hope that after I've told you something about my work, you'll share my excitement for this amazing field. Mesopotamia is the ancient name for what's now Iraq. People have often heard of it because it was home to a lot of firsts. The world's first cities, the earliest writing, the first written laws, the first diplomatic relationships, along with a host of other things. That's all true. But Mesopotamia was much more than a place of firsts. Its civilization was rich and long-lasting, surviving for more than 3,000 years. In fact, Mesopotamian civilization lasted longer than the amount of time that has passed from its demise to the present day. Mesopotamian kingdoms flourished for almost 2/3 of the time that civilization has existed on Earth. Even so, those Mesopotamian kingdoms ended up being largely forgotten for thousands of years. In contrast, ancient Greek and Roman writings were kept alive by one generation after another of scribes, scholars, and students. The same is true of the Bible and the history of the Israelites. There's an unbroken tradition of classical studies and biblical studies from ancient times to now. The study of Mesopotamian history began relatively recently, with the decipherment of their writing system about 170 years ago. This was accompanied by a flurry of archaeological excavations in Iraq, Iran, and Syria, work that has continued ever since. The excavations revealed cities of great sophistication that thrived in an era long before the Greeks, Romans, and Israelites. And the excavations uncovered ancient documents by the thousands, More than 250,000 documents have been found, many of them still unpublished. Many haven't even been read yet. So being a Mesopotamian historian is like being an explorer of uncharted waters. We make new discoveries all the time. In most fields of history, everyone knows the basic framework, the timeline and names and events that lie along it. Mesopotamia is different. Not only do unexpected kings, queens, and other prominent figures show up frequently, but when clay tablets are newly translated, entire kingdoms can emerge. There aren't many of us who specialize in ancient Mesopotamia, so there's no shortage of research projects. It's incredibly exciting to uncover new details of ancient civilizations, details that literally nobody has known about for thousands of years. Now, to answer that dinner party question, how did I get interested in this field? From about the age of 8, I wanted to be an archaeologist. But in graduate school, I decided I was going to be a historian, for reasons I'll explain in a moment. I grew up in a village south of London. My backyard was full of all sorts of interesting things. There were bowls of clay tobacco pipes and sharp fragments of willow-patterned china from the 19th century. I collected these and kept searching for more. My parents wanted to nurture my interest, so they found an archaeology program for kids at the local library. The group met once a week, and I was completely hooked. This was what I wanted to do. Later, as an undergraduate at UCLA in Southern California, a class on ancient Near Eastern archaeology captivated my interest, and I ended up taking the whole sequence of classes. I was also playing bass in a rock band. My days were filled with attending class and completing my assignments, and my evenings were taken up by the band. A couple of years later, I was back in England, doing a master's degree at the Institute of Archaeology in London. Well, my old band added a couple of new members and changed their name to the Bangles. They spent the late 1980s recording and performing around the world. But I'm happy I chose an academic career. I'd started taking classes in the ancient Mesopotamian language of Akkadian, which was written in a script known as cuneiform. Cuneiform signs are made up of straight lines with wedge-shaped heads. Cuneiform isn't an alphabet. Each sign could represent a whole word or a syllable, or even something called a determinative. Determinatives help the reader know what category a word belonged to. So you would find a determinative for city names, for the names of men and of women, and for things made of wood and so on. Each sign has more than one possible value, and each syllable can be represented by several different signs. So hundreds of cuneiform signs were used. Learning to read cuneiform and to understand Akkadian was thrilling. Reading the ancient texts was like being privy to a hidden world. So, when I returned to the US once more, I decided to do my PhD at UCLA in history rather than archaeology. Still, the two are closely tied together in the study of ancient Mesopotamia and Syria. Every cuneiform text that we read and study was dug out of the ground at some point. And knowing the exact context where it was found can add a whole additional level of understanding of its content. During graduate school, I got the opportunity to join an excavation. This was at the site of Tel Ashara in eastern Syria. What is now a small village was once a major city. It's on top of an occupation mound called a tell in Arabic, that's made up of the remains of all the settlements built on that spot over centuries. Anywhere you dig on a tell, you can't help but discover objects from the past. Of course, contemporary villagers had no interest in seeing their houses and yards dug up by archaeologists. So the excavations were mostly at the edge of the tell and in a city park. What was it like to work on a dig? It was unlike anything I'd done before. The team of graduate students and archaeologists I worked with lived in rented rooms in the village of Ashara. Our house was built in the same way that had been used there for thousands of years. It was made of mud brick, with the rooms arranged around an unpaved courtyard. There was no plumbing, and though electricity recently had been introduced in the village, and our rooms had electric lights, Air conditioning wasn't one of the conveniences. Fortunately, though, it got cool at night, and the mud brick provided insulation against the sun. I often sat on the flat roof of our house in the evenings, and I watched the sunset over the nearby fields and the river. It was beautiful. We'd wake up each morning, before the sun rose, to excavate during the coolest hours of the day. The whole team ate breakfast together around a big table. Then we headed up to the excavation where the workmen met us. I was in charge of a 10 by 10 meter square. That's a little more than 30 feet by 30 feet. I worked with 2 villagers who did most of the digging and who moved the mud out of the square. They were experienced excavators who could find the edge of a mud brick wall almost by intuition. The distinction between ancient mud brick and the ancient mud that surrounded it was a lot less obvious than I'd imagined. I dug as well, of course, and it was my job to record everything we found and to carefully excavate anything small or delicate. As spring turned to summer, the village grew hotter. On a couple of days, it reached 117 degrees in the shade. At that point, we'd retreat to the dig house and work on our documentation. Later, the team gathered again at dinner time to eat and to discuss the day's finds. On Fridays, when no one worked, we'd take bus trips to other archaeological sites. These visits included the incredible Roman cities of Palmyra and Dura Europos, and the older sites of Mari and Tel Brak. Wherever we stopped, the local people would bring out blankets, and we'd sit and talk with them. Our hosts often gave us apricots from their trees, and they'd offer us glasses of sweet tea. The part of the site where I worked held the foundations of an administrative building from the 18th century BCE. We uncovered 2 burials, along with a well, lined with large baked clay cylinders. One burial interred the remains of a tiny baby who'd been placed in a jar in the courtyard. It was really moving to lift the broken pottery and see the tiny skull inside. And we found some cuneiform tablets. These consisted of a letter and some administrative texts. I realized, as I excavated these ancient documents, that until now, no one else had read them or even touched them from the moment they'd been abandoned about 3,800 years ago. The records would help us know who'd worked in this building and what they cared about. With only a little bit of imagination, those same documents could bring ancient Terca to life and repopulate our surroundings with their ancient inhabitants. Since that time, much of my research has centered on the findings from the city of Terca and the kingdom that it dominated, a kingdom called Hana, which thrived during the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Only a handful of scholars are devoted to the study of Hana, though it lasted for several centuries. Unfortunately, to date, fewer than 100 cuneiform tablets have been identified as coming from there. No doubt we'll know a great deal more someday in the future when more tablets have been excavated. They're certainly there in the ground somewhere. Now, we're lucky that the Mesopotamians wrote on clay. That's because paper, papyrus, and parchment all disintegrate over time. Papyrus documents typically survive only in desert areas. Otherwise, there's almost nothing left after a few hundred years if they're buried in the ground. As a result, there are giant gaps in our knowledge of ancient civilizations that used organic substances to document their lives. Although many documents do survive from ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, and Israel, these are the ones that were considered so important that they were copied over and over again. Only a few managed to survive in the ground. So what's usually missing are records of daily life, the letters, administrative lists, contracts, court records, and so on, that would give us a deeper understanding of their cultures and of people who weren't the movers and shakers. Now, these are exactly the kinds of documents that we do have from Mesopotamia, and we have them in huge numbers. Some ancient clay tablets were baked on purpose to preserve them. Others were baked by accident when the buildings burned down. Baked tablets are usually well preserved. They're like bricks. Other tablets were left out in the sun to harden. They might still survive in the ground, but often they fall apart easily, and they need to be pieced together and conserved. For the most part, these clay tablets were not intended to be preserved or to be read hundreds or thousands of years in the future. They're not like stone inscriptions or great works of philosophy or literature that were copied and kept in libraries. Most tablets were quite practical. They were documents written for a particular purpose and then archived or discarded. They include lists of people receiving rations, lists of animals sent as offerings to temples, contracts recording the hiring of workmen, descriptions of court cases, multiplication tables, personal letters, records of loans, things like that. And literacy wasn't widespread. Scribes, the few men and a tiny number of women who were educated, fulfilled particular responsibilities. They don't seem to have written for introspective reasons. There aren't any Mesopotamian diaries, and even their letters tend to be very practical. So the insights we get into their lives are rarely personal, but there's a great deal that can be learned from the quotidian documents that survive. I often think about the people whose names populate the documents. I imagine that they'd be astounded to know that they've achieved a sort of immortality because of the clay tablets they left behind. We know their names, and the names of their relatives and neighbors, and the locations of their houses and fields. These were normal men and women who'd lived as farmers, priests, barbers, innkeepers. And still we analyze every detail of their lives. What social class did they belong to? Who were the members of their close social networks? How long were their generations? I recently added a new name to a Mesopotamian family tree that I'd worked on before. In doing so, I realized that two men who obviously were friends had given their sons the same name. Now, this is a minor curiosity, but I couldn't help wondering who chose the name first, and if the friend copied him when naming his son. Billions of people have lived on the planet since 1750 BCE. Even so, I feel a particular tie to the families who lived in Terka all those years ago. I've stood in their courtyards and streets. The records we find in their houses and in their neighbors' houses have brought them back to our attention centuries after they'd been completely forgotten. Fortunately, we can read these ancient words relatively easily today. This is thanks to the efforts of a number of 19th century scholars who deciphered cuneiform almost 2,000 years after it was last used. Of course, it's hard to decipher a script or language without a bilingual text that includes the same document in a known language along with an unknown one. For Egyptian hieroglyphs, the key was the Rosetta Stone. This is a stone inscription from Egypt, bearing the decree of a Ptolemaic king. It includes the same text in Greek and in two forms of Egyptian, so that all literate Egyptians could read it. The Greek version provided the key to understanding the hieroglyphic inscription. For cuneiform, one document that served this same purpose was the Behistun inscription. Unlike the Rosetta Stone, it's never been located in a museum. It's a giant carving on the side of an inaccessible mountain in Iran. The story is an interesting one. In 1836 and 1837, an intrepid scholar and adventurer named Henry Rawlinson climbed the mountain face several times. He made copies of part of the inscription. He even made some papier-mâché molds of some sections. He realized that there were 3 separate versions of the text, all in cuneiform. And he guessed, rightly as it turned out, that they might be in 3 different languages. By 1838, Rawlinson and an Irishman named Edward Hincks had deciphered the easiest of the 3 languages, with the help of an international group of scholars. Hincks had worked on cuneiform previously, and Rawlinson used some of his insights. This part of the Behistun inscription turned out to be an ancient version of the Persian language. It used an alphabetic cuneiform script with 43 characters. Old Persian was enough like Middle and Modern Persian to be understandable, and the text proved to be a royal inscription by the Persian king Darius I, who lived in the 5th century BCE. The second version of the inscription had 131 different characters and was in an ancient language called Elamite. It was deciphered later by a different group of scholars. The last version of Darius's Behistun inscription turned out to be in Akkadian, the language that was spoken and written in Mesopotamia for centuries. It was much harder to decipher. Rawlinson went back to Behistun in 1847, 10 years after he'd begun the project, to work on this third version of the text. However, Edward Hincks had already completed a lot of the decipherment using different trilingual inscriptions, also from Iran. So it was known that this form of cuneiform represented a Semitic language. By now, Hincks had sent a number of letters to scholarly societies in which he'd noted several important details about the script, and he was right about all of them. He'd even figured out values for many of the signs. But Henry Rawlinson is almost always credited with having deciphered Akkadian cuneiform. So who really managed this feat? While both men worked hard during the late 1840s and 1850s, Hincks made the best progress. And we now know that he had the most accurate values for the signs. Rawlinson grew annoyed with his colleague and even mocked his conclusions. He suggested that Hincks had a few fortunate hits, but was mostly wrong. To start with, Rawlinson thought the cuneiform writing system had grown out of the Egyptian system, and he thought it was mostly alphabetic. He was mistaken. Hincks recognized that every cuneiform sign could be read as a complete syllable. Each one could be read as a consonant plus a vowel, or a vowel plus a consonant, or a combination of consonants and vowels. But not one of them represented a consonant all by itself. He was right about all of this. By 1857, Rawlinson had come around to agreeing with Hincks's conclusions. They and two other scholars identified the values of hundreds of cuneiform signs, and they mastered most of the grammar of the Akkadian language as well. In the same year, the Royal Asiatic Society in London came up with a test to see if the decipherment was successful. They gave a newly discovered cuneiform inscription to all four men and had them translated, independently of one another. Their translations turned out to be pretty much the same. The code had been cracked. Edward Hincks died in 1866, and Rawlinson ended up getting most of the credit. But more and more scholars now recognize that Hincks was the real genius who figured out the major keys to the decipherment of Akkadian. Students often ask me how we know what ancient Akkadian sounded like. We can't be sure of every detail, but Akkadian is enough like later Semitic languages for us to be pretty confident that we know how it sounded. We're also lucky that the script regularly reflects not just the consonants, but also the vowels. In this, it's different from Egyptian hieroglyphs and from later alphabetic scripts, like Phoenician and early Hebrew. Once Akkadian was deciphered, it was possible to decode some of the other ancient languages that were written in cuneiform. One of the most important of these was Sumerian. This was the language of ancient Sumer, the southern part of Mesopotamia, and it was probably the language of the ancient inventors of the writing system. Sumerian was used in literature and religion long after it had ceased to be a spoken language. So ancient scribes had long lists of Sumerian words and their Akkadian equivalents. These lists helped with the modern decipherment. Once cuneiform was understood, a great deal of work was done in translating Mesopotamian documents. This provided a lot of the groundwork for those of us who have come after those early scholars. They introduced us to great kings like Sargon of Akkad and Hammurabi of Babylon. They produced editions of law codes and royal inscriptions. They shone a light on a world that had not been known before. And they inspired generations of archaeologists to find and excavate the ancient occupation mounds where the cities and towns of these ancient peoples lay buried. Despite the longevity of their civilization over thousands of years, Mesopotamians faced constant threats. These could take the form of warfare and natural disasters, disease, infections, crop damage, famine, and deaths of loved ones. The Mesopotamians could control none of these. So they treasured the order they could maintain. They had close communities, and they valued and supported their friends and families. They developed a judicial system. They expected contracts and treaties to be upheld and obligations to be met. And they emphasized kindness and civility in their interactions. It always strikes me that they, or most of them at least, were people I would like to have known. So let's get to know them. In this course, we'll explore the Mesopotamian world from the era of the first settlements more than 12,000 years ago to the earliest cities in the 4th millennium BC, and we'll end up in the 6th century BCE when Mesopotamia was conquered by the Persian Empire during the reign of Cyrus the Great. And the people there were no longer ruled by a government within their own land. We'll look at religion, which pervaded everyone's understanding of the universe, and at kingship, society, agriculture, trade, justice, literature, art, warfare, daily life, and more. And we'll encounter some extraordinary people. Kings like Sargon, who created the world's first empire, and Ur-Nama, who developed the first written laws, and Tushratta, who maintained an affectionate correspondence with the pharaohs of Egypt. Others were religious leaders like Enheduanna, a priestess who survived an attempt to expel her and wrote hymns about her experiences. We'll meet princesses like Kiram of Mari, who was so miserable in her marriage that she threatened to jump off the roof of her husband's palace, and authors like Sinleke Unini, who wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh. Some of the people who illuminate this era would never have guessed that they'd be remembered so many thousands of years later. These include Amat Shamash, a woman who bequeathed her house to her daughter, only to have her brothers contest it in court after her death. You might be surprised that a written will, spoken testimony, and justice prevailed on her behalf of the younger woman in the face of her more powerful uncles. All of these people, and millions of others like them, lived and loved, worried and celebrated during the long centuries of Mesopotamia's power. They cared about the events of their day with the same passion that we have for events in our lives. And they had no idea how things would turn out. It's always tempting to see history as somehow inevitable, that the way things did happen was the only way they could have happened. We reflexively tend to think of these people as simply going along with the script. But that's not true. Each person was an actor in this vast panorama of history, responding to the events of their time. But they had no lines to read. They were making it up as they went along. The documents and objects and buildings that survive give us a window into their lives. We can read their words, stand in their houses, admire their sculptures, and try our best to reconstruct their world and to understand them.